Mississauga, Heather Hayes, Executive Director of the Orangeville Food Bank, and Kirsten Beardsley, CEO of Food Banks Canada. In the room, we are also joined by food bank representatives from across our network, including the Burlington Food Bank, the Food Bank Waterloo Region, Hamilton Food Chair, Brockville and Area Food Bank, Kawartha Lakes Food Source, Daily Bread Food Bank, North York Harvest Food Bank, the Compass Food Bank, and Eden Food for Change. I want to thank the speakers next to me and the food banks here today for joining us. Your presence shows the strength of our collective network and our unwavering commitment of food banks have to both their communities and to advocating for solutions to the rising tide of food insecurity and poverty in our province. As we stand together during Hunger Action Month, we are confronted with a devastating reality. The data we are about to share reveals that food bank use has reached an all-time high in Ontario. For the 8th consecutive year, food bank use has increased, with over 1 million people accessing our food banks last year alone, visiting more than 7.6 million times. This is double the number of people who accessed the food bank just 4 years ago. While these numbers are staggering, I want to remind everyone that these numbers are not just statistics. They are adults, seniors, and children who live in our communities. 1 million people represents 1 million people in Ontario not having enough food to eat, 1 million people having to make impossible choices between paying their rent and choosing groceries for their family, and 1 million people not being able to keep their head above water and needing help, and 1 million people individually walking through the door of a food bank for groceries that they would otherwise have to go without. This number should be deeply troubling to the people of our province and terrifying to our governments. I have been with Ontario for 15 years, and there was once a time where I thought this number was impossible. I can't help but wonder, when did this all change? When did we begin to accept that people going hungry in our communities was okay? When did we accept that it was okay for some Ontarians to thrive while we leave others drowning? When we look at our data, we know that the primary reason that people are turning to food banks is because housing costs are too high, income is not keeping up with the cost of today's living, and because Ontario's social support programs are not meeting the needs of people who are relying on them. People in Ontario are drowning in the rising tide of unaffordability. The cost of living has surged, and for too many people, there's simply no life raft in sight. Instead of being thrown a lifeline, more and more people are being pulled under, trapped in the cycle of poverty, and living in circumstances that make it impossible to get their heads above water. So what will it take for our government to make meaningful change and start to turn the tide? While there is no quick fix to food insecurity and poverty, we would like to put forward the following 3 recommendations as the first step that the Government of Ontario can take to address these issues. 1, prioritize affordable housing. As the largest monthly expense in most household budgets, this is one of the fastest ways to improve affordability in the province. We call on the province to prioritize investments in affordable and supportive housing and tenant protections. 2, ensure Ontarians can earn enough income for today's cost of living. This includes ensuring jobs in Ontario are quality jobs that provide a living wage, improving labor laws, and reducing barriers to unionization. And finally, strengthening Ontario's social safety net by increasing social assistance rates so that people who rely on Ontario Works and the Ontario Disability Support Program have enough income to afford their basic necessities each month. To conclude my portion of the presentation, I want to emphasize that the data I shared today should ring alarm bells for all of us, and that 1 million people accessing food banks in Ontario should not only serve as a wake-up call, but a call to action. People are drowning in this crisis, but they don't have to be. Solutions to food insecurity and poverty are within our reach. And the organizations standing beside me and in this room are proof of what we can do when we work together. But we cannot continue to shoulder this burden alone. The Government of Ontario must step up and commit to reducing the torrent of poverty in our province and making meaningful change that supports the health and well-being of all Ontarians. It's time for all of us, as advocates, community leaders, and policymakers, to act with urgency. Let's turn the tide and bring 1 million people down to zero. Now I'd like to invite Kirsten Beardsley of Food Banks Canada to speak to these issues from a national perspective.
Thank you, Carolyn. I am proud to be standing today with food bankers from Ontario, partners who work in and care about food insecurity, and those who are accessing food banks across the province and across this country. I am proud to be standing with people who don't give up, even when we have to announce heartbreaking records like Carolyn just did. People who roll up their sleeves, get to work, and make sure everyone has access to food, even when the numbers seem impossible, even when the donations aren't as plentiful, and even when it feels like no one is listening. I'm sure I can speak for the food bankers here when I say that we are tired of breaking records. We are tired of coming to the media and saying that things have only gotten worse. And we are tired of feeling like those in government who should be responding with a sense of urgency aren't hearing the alarm bells that we're ringing. I'm sure there are days when food bankers would like to turn away from the problem, dismiss it, pretend it isn't as big of a deal as it really is. But we can't. Because as Carolyn said, we're not talking today about numbers. We're talking today about people. Real people with real stories walking through our doors. So no, we will not turn away. But we cannot continue to allow governments to turn away either. And because governments don't seem to be listening, I want to talk directly to Canadians today. I know that you, like us, can't abide by a country where more seniors, more kids, more newcomers, where more of our neighbors, of our family, and our friends are having to turn to food banks than ever before. I know this isn't what we want for the future of this province or the future of this country. Please know that food banks are showing up to help every single day, and we won't turn away. But please also know that we need your help in making sure governments listen and understand the urgency of this situation. We need to be as loud as possible to make sure that over 1 million people going to food banks in Ontario never ever becomes the status quo. We need your help to make sure governments can no longer turn away. Thank you for joining us in the fight towards our vision of a Canada where no one goes hungry.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Representing one of the largest cities in Ontario, I'd like to welcome Megan Nichols of Food Banks Mississauga, whose organization has been experiencing an unprecedented growth in food bank visits.
Thank you, Carolyn and Kirsten, for shedding light on the growing number of neighbors who are unable to make ends meet, and welcome everyone to Food Banks Mississauga this morning. I wish I could say that things look different in Mississauga, but unfortunately I can't. In fact, the city of Mississauga has seen the largest escalation in food bank visits in all of Ontario or Canada in the last 12 months. Over the last year, Food Banks Mississauga and our network of over 60 agency members provided food support to over 56,000 neighbors, over 420,000 times. That's 8% of Mississauga's population, 58% more people than last year. And sadly, we also saw an increase of 42% in children using the food bank in Mississauga. Back in 2019, 1 in 37 residents of our city came to the food bank, and now it's 1 in every 13. More of our neighbors are falling further behind. And this ultimately has mostly to do with the lack of government action, from underfunding social assistance and settlement services to a lack of investment in supportive and affordable housing and delays in modernizing programs to support workers' rights. This lack of action has led to an erosion of fundamental human rights for the most vulnerable in our communities. Food banks are not a government-funded social service, something most people don't know. We rely almost entirely on donations to provide the service to the community. And now the increased costs of living have also impacted the giving capacity of individuals. And folks are telling us who used to donate to the food bank that they're now coming to access our services. Faced with increased challenges in securing donor dollars and a changing fundraising landscape, donations to food security organizations are needed more than ever. So let's recap what we're seeing here in Mississauga. More people need more support more often. Our governments have not adequately invested to support residents' right to food. And the folks who used to donate to the food bank, not government funded, are now struggling financially themselves. And now recent data from Statistics Canada and Food Banks Canada tells us that this fall, food banks need to brace for a tidal wave of increased demand, as almost 1/4 of all Canadian residents expect to need help from a community agency this fall. This drastic increase in need, along with the deep underinvestments that have caused it, means we're starting to see reports from across the country of food banks closing, reducing hours, sharing photos of empty shelves. And here at Food Banks Mississauga, we are nearing that capacity as well. Without significant funding or legislation intervention, we will not be able to meet the needs of our community. And this is a crisis that's only growing. What is it going to take for our elected officials to respond? Is 1 million Ontario residents enough? Is it enough that homebound seniors call us asking for incontinence products because they can't buy them themselves? Is it enough that 16,000 kids in Mississauga only eat because someone else donated? If you join us in the conviction that no one in our communities should be food insecure, we need your action and we need your voice. If you're able, please make a donation to your local food bank to ensure your neighbors have food today. And then contact your elected officials and demand that they take action to reduce poverty to ensure our neighbors have their right to food met for tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. It is not just big cities. Food banks in every corner of this province are experiencing the challenges as they face the rising demand that Megan talked about. I will now invite Heather Hayes, Executive Director of the Orangeville Food Bank, to speak to the realities of food bank use in her community.
Good morning. My name is Heather Hayes. I'm the Executive Director. It is a privilege to do so of the Orangeville Food Bank, and I represent a rural agricultural county about an hour northwest of the GTA. I could talk to you about stats. I could tell you about the fact that we have seen a 38% increase in the amount of individuals accessing the food bank this year. Or I could tell you that when I started in 2015, we saw 380 individuals accessing our service. In August of last month, we saw 1,422. That is almost a 280% increase in the amount of people accessing the food bank in 9 years. I could tell you that we have seen a 41% increase in the amount of individuals who are working accessing the food bank this year. I could tell you that the rents have gone up, that it's gutting people's budgets, that mortgages are more than ever, and people's living wages do not match the cost of living. And I could also tell you that my perishable spending this month and for the last year has gone up 94% to buy milk, eggs, and produce. And for the first time ever, I have to buy non-perishable items to stock the shelves, not to keep them full, but just to keep some items on the shelf. But instead, I want to connect you to the 4 words at the bottom of the Hunger Action Month email banner. What's your biggest challenge? My challenge is coming in the food bank and greeting individuals who look a heck of a lot like my boys, who look a heck of a lot like my neighbors, and who look a heck of a lot like my parents. But the hardest is the kiddos who look like my dearest darling Daisy, my granddaughter. That really smarts. I could tell you about the individual who comes and apologizes to me for using the food bank and then wants to retell their gutting story about why they're there so that I know that they're not scamming the system. I could tell you that I lay awake at night trying to figure out how I'm going to find more storage, more food, more money, because we are no longer an emergency response. We are the safety net for many in our community. But my biggest challenge is not using salty language when government staffers tell me there's a program for that. If there was, we wouldn't be here today. They don't exist. So, I am in support of increasing housing stocks. In fact, I'm in support of all the housing. Seniors housing, singles housing, family housing, homeless housing, all the housings. I'm in support of a living wage. I am in support of increasing social assistance rates. There is no problem so great that it cannot be solved. But policy change is what is going to bring us back from this crisis. So to quote Theodore Roosevelt, this country will never be a permanently good place to live unless it is a reasonably good country for all of us to live in. Food should be a right, not a privilege. Currently in Ontario, it is a privilege that 1 million Ontarians cannot afford. I ask for change. I plead for change. I ask all government officials, all Ontarians, in fact all Canadians, to do what they can to change the tide on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Sorry, I need a moment. I would now like to open the floor for questions. Please feel free to address your questions to me or any of our food bank representatives here today.
Let's see if I use salty language.
What's the relationship in Dufferin County? Does the county support the food bank in any way at all, or what's the relationship that exists?
I am incredibly lucky that the county councillors and the staff of the County of Dufferin support the food bank. Last year they supported us with $50,000, and for that we're very, very thankful. But my budget is $1.4 million this year. $50,000, well, I'm again incredibly grateful for it, and for the work that the staff and the county councillors do. It's a drop in the bucket for me.
And is this a problem? I know you represent Dufferin County, but it seems that rural areas are part that might be overlooked. Is this a problem you see referring to other rural municipalities?
Absolutely. Food banks were started as an emergency response eons ago, 10 decades ago. And it was started typically by a group of community members, church ladies, that sort of thing, who wanted to solve this problem. But most of the rural food banks are still volunteer-led. They don't have the resources to do what I can do in Orangeville right now. And so they're trying to put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound out in the rural community. And there isn't transportation to get people to where they need to be, to access services. It's really dire. Not that it isn't dire in Mississauga and across Ontario, but rural Ontarians have different challenges that really impact them.
Oh, sorry, Heather, while you're up there, can you just clarify? So when you said that you were told by government staffers that there's a program, for what ministry are you talking about, and what specific topic was that conversation about?
So it was about social assistance rates, and it was during a delegation to the province on increasing social assistance rates with one of the lower tier municipalities in Dufferin. And yes, they were clear. There were programs for that. I did go back. I called my municipality. I checked on those programs. Nope. So I think they're delusional. That might not be appropriate. I think they're a bit delusional in what they think they're doing for the individuals in our community, and they're not in touch with the realities of the people that they serve.
Like there's a disconnect is what you're saying.
Huge. They're not going to bed hungry. They're not going to bed without a job. They're not going to sleep in an alley. They've got all the things going on for them. Our people don't have the things, and they need the things.
Have you guys ever had a visit from a government minister, from the premier to one of your food banks? And what was the takeaway from that?
So I'll let them speak around the takeaway, but we invite MPs to city councilors, mayors, to all of our food banks. I would say all of our food banks have done that, and many have visited our food banks. We provide numbers to the Premier's office monthly, so they are aware of the need in this province, but I can let Megan speak to what, and Heather's, in terms of having officials at their food bank.
Often officials point to previous interventions that have already happened. You know, the 5% increase to ODSP that happened back in 2018, or, you know, other investments that have been made. But we're here and we're now, and those investments haven't made a difference. I think the most challenging part is elected officials kind of, you know, patting you on the shoulder and saying, thank you so much for your work. I don't need shoulder pats. We need interventions that have people have enough money that they can live. Like, relying on a food bank to get your incontinence products, like, how sad are we as a society when we're like, seniors, you can just call a charity to ask for something to deal with your urine. Like, I mean, it is just so messed up and so far gone that we think that interventions that have already happened are enough to deal with numbers that just keep growing. And so I think, as Heather said, the disconnect between policy levers and the impacts in the community are distinct. And I think perhaps elected officials, I joked with a minister a number of years ago, I said, I'd love to trade you budgets. How about you run the Ministry of Community Services on a charity budget, and I'll run the Ministry of Community Services with your budget, and we'll see who can have more impact. And they laughed. I didn't laugh, because I think there's a lot of money spent on a lot of things, but clearly it's not the right things if 1 million people still have to go to a food bank.
Question here for CBC. What are the top 3 things that you think need to be funded to help people who are really in need? What are the top priorities over the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I think, as we said, so making sure that the implementation of the National Housing Strategy, so the building of affordable and supportive housing, that they're on time or even ahead is a great idea. Raising social assistance rates. So as we know, both ODSP and ODW put you below the poverty line, and not just somewhat below, very far below, that you cannot afford your basic necessities. So ensuring that is done. And also, you know, what we've seen, the school nutrition program is a great start. There's been a federal commitment, but we need the province to do their part and commit to the other half, so that children, who are a third of who we support, are guaranteed meals. Without government intervention, yes.
I want to ask a little bit about the disconnect, and also thinking about not necessarily where fault lies, but who maybe not doing their fair share as lately as possible. The disconnect, when we hear about the disconnect today and before, you talk about what government officials say has been done, and they'll point to things that have happened that may take time to be kind of like interest rates on the economy. It takes time for things to settle. Do you think oftentimes there's that disconnect is the fact that they don't see the dire need, even if you're trying to put it in their face, or they're willfully blind?
So I'm going to be diplomatic today, but what I'll say is I think there's two issues. One, they've begun to rely on food banks as a social support mechanism as opposed to an emergency measure. We are not part of the social safety net. We are an emergency measure for an emergency need. So we are here to serve hungry people today, but we do not solve food insecurity. And we have been very clear about that. We are here to provide that emergency response. To address food insecurity and poverty, we need long-term responses. So policy, implementation, different changes to programs to allow those changes to take place. One of the challenges we see, unfortunately, is that many governments think in 4-year stints. So if it's not going to be effective in 4 years, it's not a priority to them. And unfortunately, in a lot of circumstances, people who are living in poverty and all of our visitors that we represent are not the people they're trying to impress. So they forget about the urgency of need for the people who are living day to day. And what I think they're forgetting is there's a lot of us and them, but they're Ontarians. They are people going to work, they're children at school, they're seniors, as Megan spoke about. All of these individuals need help, and they know the data. We share this data every single month, and we yell it from the rooftops. But until they see this sense of urgency, there's not going to be change.
As you were talking about the hearing now, food banks frankly seem to be part of the social safety net of this modern world that we live in. Whether or not they should be, we just got a question as to how to look at larger pieces of the pie to deal with the systemic issues. But what does it say about society where you're asking regular Ontarians to fill the gap that government isn't doing?
What does it say about regular Ontarians?
What does it say about our society?
That we've gone in the wrong direction. That we've accepted the dismantling of the social safety net over the last 30 years. What the funniest thing is, it's been a little bit secret. They've just chipped away at that social safety net, all the social policies that have helped to protect workers, that have helped to protect our seniors, that have helped to protect children and those in need. They've dismantled these programs slowly over 30 years, and now we're at a place seeing the results of that dismantling. You know, investments in something like as a modernization of EI, even something federal, a federal program. EI program doesn't allow for many people who pay into it to access it because it hasn't been modernized in 20 years. And so the government needs to make sure that it's keeping up with today, with the realities that people are facing today, and with the needs that people have today.
I have a couple of other questions.
Sure.
So in October, minimum wage is set to increase to what, $17.20? How much of a difference do you think that could be?
I mean, negligible again. Like, those are one of many policy levers. Like, we have to remember there's no silver bullet for poverty and food insecurity. And it's a multi-pronged approach is what we need when it comes to policy. That's one great first step for sure. Changes to social assistance, school nutrition program, housing, all of these will help to create the effective change that we need long term.
And yesterday the Premier talked about the number of jobs the government has created since taking office. 800,000 was the number that he had cited. I mean, this is kind of central to the government's policy. I was just taking a look at the 2023 annual report for the poverty reduction strategy from MCCS, which says by 2024 they want to move at least 60,000 people off of social assistance and into employment every single year. So job creation is obviously a core tenet for the Ford government. Does job creation or those jobs solve this problem at all? Because clearly there's still a million people using it.
Yeah, job creation is great, but my question in response would be, are they the right type of jobs? Are they jobs that provide a living wage? Are they jobs that come with benefits? Are they jobs that come with paid sick days? Because are they equal pay for equal work? Because do they include wage theft, which is a huge issue for minimum wage workers and wage workers? And the gig economy. Now 1 in 10, I think it's actually even higher than that now, workers in Ontario actually work in the gig economy. So they're not covered by the Employment Standards Act. They don't have access to EI or any worker supports. So job creation is great and a key component again, but it's the details. They get lost in the details where we have to make sure that we have quality work for people. Because a job is great, but when it's still, we see people who work. If you remember, 1 in 6 people who visit a food bank is employed. So, and that's one of the fastest rising groups. So employment is, yes, key, but it's not necessarily always enough.
I want to ask about the role of corporations. I mean, the rich keep getting richer, as we know, and CEOs, CFOs are all making record salaries. Do you think corporations have a role to play in the situation that we're in right now?
I mean, I think from the perspective that I just ensuring quality work with quality pay, proper benefits, all of those, the supports that they can do. As we know, as charities, we're very grateful for the support that we get from corporations, because without it, to be quite honest, our doors would be closed. And without the government doing their role, we're reliant on donations to be able to fulfill our mandate and to operate day to day. But I think just as everyone has a role, I think the public has a role, I think the government, charitable organizations, advocates, and the public, everyone has a role to play in making change in food insecurity and poverty.
Can you speak to the diversity of users? People also have issues in mind. That food bank sort of dispel that diversity.
Yeah, I think oftentimes hunger doesn't look like what you'd expect. So we see people from all walks of life. As we mentioned, a third of food bank users are children. We see unemployed, employed individuals. We see people on social assistance, seniors, single parent, two parent families, people from urban households, rural households, homeowners, rental tenants. So it's really hard to distinguish to know if someone's struggling with food insecurity. The number is now less than 1 in 30 Ontarians. So if you think about a child in a classroom, or someone who sat beside you on a bus this morning, or probably even a colleague of yours in your office, depending on what their scenario is. So we often, please don't discriminate, and know we always, forward as food banks, we err on the side of generosity. We want to be generous with whatever interpretation is why people need assistance, and the only criteria we have for coming to a food bank is need. So if you are in need, please come to our door so we can help.
And it's clear that this issue is not going to go away without government intervention, but without that intervention, where do you forecast the situation going in terms of what do you see in years to come that's going to happen to people?
I think I can speak for everyone behind me that we're terrified. We are trying to ring the alarm bells. That's what today is about. September is Hunger Action Month, and this is the call to action. Because if you were a regular company, would you be able to deal with service demand, 135% increase in 4 years on a limited shoestring budget? We are terrified for what's to come. We are doing some modeling to see what the future holds to try and prepare. But ultimately, we have, 70% of food banks are already reporting that they're having trouble stocking shelves and worried about shelves going bare, and 50% are experiencing shortages when it comes to funds to operate. So those numbers, often we are the last stand before homelessness as well, because people are choosing housing between housing and food. So this is a very serious issue, and I hope everyone listening today, both the public and the government, is taking this as an urgent call to action to go make change. Speak to your government officials. Visit our website. We have all of our recommendation, a petition to sign, Hunger in My Riding, which is a great tool to actually learn about what the actual need is in your community, or visit your food bank. As you can see, they can share that data head on. Any more questions today? Okay, with that, I just want to say thank you again for everyone for being here today, and please make sure to call your local representative, sign the petition, visit our website or in your local food bank's website, and please help us make change today. Thank you.